Hey everybody, it's ShadowStar here for me to go over my ranking of Series 2 of the modern Doctor Who. So, Series 2 is a bit more of an interesting one. I feel like it's a bit more top-heavy. Series 1 was quite balanced, where even the lower end of the episodes were pretty good. This one where it's like, it kind of works its way up, but once again, no episode is truly god-awful, and even when we start to get, even the relatively low ones on the list are still pretty good. That being said, let's get the obvious two out of the way and go on with my 10th position. At lowest position for this season, it's Fear Her. I think everyone saw this coming. Who doesn't not like Fear Her? Again, it's not awful, it's got a few scenes that are alright, but like, there's just so much bad about it. The child acting is bad, hearing the stupid Kookaburra song is bad, the Doctor's out of for half the time, and if you're going to have an episode where the Doctor's missing for half the time, you better make it good, but not much happens other than some awful child acting and some awful singing. You know, it kind of starts off alright with a little mystery of people disappearing, and then it just kind of falls off the deep end once we get into it. It's such a shame too. This episode could have been a bit better, but other than that, it's like, let's have some crappy child acting, some weird drawings, and some annoying songs. And what do you get? An episode I really want to skip. Speaking of episodes that people usually don't like, episode 9 is Love and Monsters. And, okay, I can see why people don't like it. It's a Doctor Light episode that really wasn't as powerful as later ones. It's not as bad as people give it hate for. I don't hate the Absorbaloff, and I don't hate the episode. There are some good moments. I like the continuity with, like, with Elton referencing all the things that have happened throughout the series. And I feel like one really understated part of this episode is Jackie. And although she's not in it a lot, it really delves into what it's like for Jackie now that Rose is off traveling. I think that is honestly the biggest highlight of this episode, and so many people overlook it. I feel like this is a really good highlight episode for her of all things, and I like that. Then you get on to the villain where, okay, he's crazy, he's hammy, he's a little bit silly, but at the same time, I feel like because I got such a good actor to play him, he's still quite fun and enjoyable, and yeah, it's pretty good when you consider the fact that this episode was created by a literal kid who, well, they're not a kid anymore, they're the same age as me, and if you're unfamiliar with them, they're a YouTuber known as Channel Pup who created the Absorbaloff. But anyway, I don't think the Absorbaloff is that bad. Honestly, I think I quite enjoy it. It's a bit silly, but I think it's quite a cool idea, and, you know, they just decided to go with the serious approach. But when you get it down to it, it's also quite a dark and sad episode because, you know, you feel so bad for them. They had such a fun time, and then he comes along and ruins everything, even before he started killing them off. Oh yeah, I remembered why some people hate this episode. There's a weird concrete joke at the very end where he says, "We still have a love life." Don't think about that joke too much. Just don't think about it. But the rest of it is like, it's not that bad. There's some highlights in this episode, and I think Jackie's really good. Anyway, moving to pretty much every episode from this point on is all great. That being said, my 8th position is New Earth. I feel like for what is essentially the first full story with the 10th Doctor, they could have done a bit better. And don't get me wrong, it's still a pretty good episode, and it was good to have Cassandra back. It's like, let's bring back an old villain, that's great. You know, let's explore what is technically the first time Modern Who has done a new planet, although we didn't do much with it because it's very Earth-like, as the name would imply. But, you know, this time, as opposed to Cassandra just being a very hammy one-note villain in the first season, here she gets some depth near the end, which is really good. And you got to give credit to the acting. The acting on both Rose and the Doctor is really good, although quite campy at times, but still very fun. But at the same time, because of that, you end up with half the episode where the Doctor or Rose isn't technically here, and it's early on in the episode, and you want a bit more depth. But oh well, you still got plenty of good Doctor moments, especially like when he's confronting the cat people and so on, so, yeah. And although it's another case of everybody lives, except for that one cat lady who fell down the elevator shaft. But otherwise, it's very much an everybody lives moment at the end. But it's still a pretty good episode. Like I said, there's no bad episodes at this point. People might be shocked by this, but in 7th position is Girl in the Fireplace. Again, I actually really enjoyed this episode. just everything after this is better. But, I feel like the weak point of this episode is Mickey. This is Mickey's first adventure off-world, and, like, he had a few fun scenes, but I wish they gave him slightly more depth. They at least try to do that in the next story, but still, I wish they'd done more with that. It is one of the first major points in the entire modern series that the Doctor starts to get a bit too romantic, and I've never been a big fan of the Doctor being romantic, whether it's with a one-off character or a companion, so yeah, I'm not that fond of it, but at the same time, it's a nice episode. I do think Renette plays very well. But, when we're not in France, when we're just wandering around the ship, there's not much. And, again, for being Mickey's first episode, Rose and Mickey do jack all in this episode. It's all about the Doctor and Renette. It feels like a classic story where we have to shove half the cast aside. That happens quite a lot. Actually, I've noticed that's very much a trend of Moffat stories, is he wants to split people up and let the Doctor interact with a new character. Whether it's interacting with the girl in The Empty Child, interacting with Renette, interacting with River in the library, he always liked to split the companions off. Except this time he didn't give the companions much to do. Oh well. Let's move on to Age of Steel. Again, this is a bloody good episode, but it only got to be in my 6th position. Age of Steel and Rise of the Cybermen. I do think Age of Steel should be the first name, but it's actually the second name. But getting to this episode, I feel like this is a two-parter done right. The pacing is pretty good. We're 2 seasons in and we're already delving into parallel worlds, although Classic Who had already done that before. But it's also the first time we get introduced to the Cybermen, except for a minor cameo in Season 1. And obviously it's the big highlight episode for Mickey, where he goes from being the nobody to the hero by the end of the episode. Again, and I feel like the destruction of the Cybermen is at least paid off a bit better, because it's kind of, you've got that scene where that one Cyberman has its emotions removed, and I suppose that's a good setup for how they defeat them. And the villain's pretty good too, and I get a lot, and they kind of change the Cybermen, because in Classic Who, the Cybermen were based on the fear of cybernetics, whereas here they're based on the idea of losing your emotions. I mean, they had no emotions in Classic Who either, but it was the idea of humans replacing themselves, whereas here it's the idea of being uniform and emotionless, because now we no longer have that fear of humans replacing body parts if we really need to, especially now that technology's gotten better. So I like the way they tried to re-angle the Cyberman to still work for a modern day, especially since, this is the early 2000s, and it was the dawn of everyone just beginning to get smartphones, which was a point they really captured in this episode, when everyone has, like, smartphones and earpieces and so on. And, smartphones have only gotten bigger since, so, they were kind of on the mark with that kind of, let's hit on the fear of something new. So they still managed to capture the similar theme of the old Cybermen while making it modern. Very well done. But anyway, and have I not complimented the music? My goodness, it's Murray Gold, how can I not compliment? But the Cybermen theme, like, when they're running to the blimp and everything's going crazy, that escape scene music is incredible. There's a couple of slow scenes here and there, once again with Jackie and Pete, but otherwise, this is a crazy action episode, which I really love, and a good highlight episode for Mickey. Now for a very fun, underrated episode, it's Tooth and Claw. I feel like this, being Series 2 and early on, this is the first episode that truly highlights the 10th Doctor and Rose. Because, New Earth, we kind of got distracted by Cassandra, and the Christmas episode was all him asleep. This is the first time where it's Rose and the Doctor together as a team. They're split up for a tiny bit, but for the most part, it's Rose and the Doctor as a team, and it really showcases them together. And it's just nice to have a nice, down-to-earth, fun, simple, self-contained episode. All the characters are pretty good. It's got amazing music. It's great to have a simple, more average episode like that, and I really like that. It's not crazy over the top like the two-parters. It's not, let's pull at your heartstrings. It just feels like essential Doctor Who, and that's brilliant. I love that. I'm going to give 4th position to Idiot's Lantern. I think this is one that so many people don't like, but I love. I get it, the villain itself can get quite annoying near the end, a little bit too over the top and hammy, but the rest of this episode is pretty good. You've got the emotional stuff with, like, the Doctor and the family confronting that one guy who's a real jerk. Then, obviously, since the Doctor partially loses Rose, this is one of the first times you really get to see the fury of the 10th Doctor, which is great. You get an action scene near the end with the Doctor climbing the frame. You get a bit of everything in this episode. Doctor and Rose as a team, the Doctor furious without Rose. It's kind of like take all the it's kind of like the inverse version of Fear Her, where this time the Rose is missing and your Doctor's furious and all that stuff. And we get to tie it in with history, so I really like the Idiot's Lantern, and if you can overlook the slightly annoying villain near the end, I really like it, and there's a lot of good stuff to love in this episode. Moving on to the top 3, we have the finale, Doomsday, and Army of Ghosts. These top 3 were tricky to pick, but I felt, first off, I'm not a big fan of the emotional ending because I've never been a fan of the Doctor falling in love with Rose or any character, so the whole beach scene I don't care for at all. Let's just get that out of the way. That being said, you've got Daleks and Cybermen in the same episode confronting each other. The Daleks and Cybermen confronting each other is incredible. You have the Cybermen kind of teaming up with the Doctor for a brief moment. You get the introduction of the Cult of Skara, who are going to continue on for several episodes. There's a lot of stuff set up in this episode. This is an episode where Jackie, she doesn't go off-world, but she kind of gets to be in the adventure. This is unknowingly a highlight episode for Jackie, of all people, which is really great. Of all the people to do stuff in this episode, who better to have it than Jackie, We've had Rose have plenty of adventures. Now let's put Jackie in the middle of the action and see what happens. You get to confront Torchwood, which means you get a lot of good moments where the Doctor confronts people. You really get a lot of stuff. You get amazing music because you get both the Cybermen and the Dalek theme. There's a lot of good stuff in this, and there's a lot of action. There's a lot of, I know some people praise the beach scene or the scene where Rose is falling. I'm not that a big fan of it, but otherwise, it's a great episode for Jackie. It's a great episode that really sums up Series 2 by bringing back the people from the other parallel dimension and Jackie. And, it's the end of an era because you're not just losing Rose, you're losing Mickey and Jackie as well. They've kind of been recurring characters through the first 2 seasons, so to see them go as well as Rose, it's the end of an era, and Doctor Who going forward is going to be much different. And, it's a nice change of pace, but this is a great way to top off the end of Series 2. Now, I think a lot of people overlook this next one. I'm giving my second position to Satan Pit, an episode I absolutely adore, and I think a lot of people overlook this. People overlook this for things like the Cybermen or other stuff in this season, but I love it. First off, the music. I know usually I've been praising the bombastic music, but there's some really somber, eerie music in this episode. Like the scene where that guy the guy who's possessed is outside the dome and looking at Scooty through the window, and there's this emptiness music that plays. It's just so good and beautiful. It really captures this whole episode really captures the feeling of being like alone at the end of the world with just this small collection of people and the TARDIS missing for the whole show. And, it really gets a lot of good moments for all the characters. You split off the Doctor and Rose, and this time I think they really do it well because you get to see everyone kind of working as a team. It's kind of the first example of a Space Under Siege episode because there's a crew and they're being picked off one by one, but not everyone dies, and you get to get attached to the few characters who do survive. The moment at the end where the Doctor finally finds a TARDIS and everyone's saved, I really like that. But even before that, the moment where they're not sure if they're going to survive and Rose is having to leave without the Doctor, that's such a good moment too. This is, to me, one of the biggest highlight episodes for Rose, without making a big fuss about it, if that makes sense. Other episodes try to highlight Rose, but they do it in an over-top or emotional way. I feel like this is an episode that highlights Rose as an independent character very well, which is great because afterwards she's either leaving or just not in the episodes. So I feel like this is such a good self-contained episode that manages to be creepy, has a very ambiguous villain, and just has a great feeling of being alone at the end of the world and the emptiness of the music. oh, it's so underrated. It's a perfect episode. I love this episode. I'm going to easily give the top position, though, to School Reunion. This, first off, is a highlight episode for 10th Doctor. The moments where he's confronting the principal are some of the best 10th Doctor scenes, especially for Series 2. Obviously, we have to talk about Sarah Jane coming back, and it's the first time we'd really pulled on a lot of references to Classic Who since the classic series, which is great. And to see her come back, and, we hadn't really brought back any other classic companions until now. So it's great to have Sarah Jane come back and, seeing all the little references, and they really pay a perfect homage to everything that had happened in the classic series, and the moment where she first re-encounters the Doctor is just brilliant. There's this great music piece whenever we kind of harken back to classic days, which I really like as well, and to have K9 back and have it be John Leeson doing the voice, that's great as well. And obviously this episode pretty much set up a spin-off, so, you go from having one of the longest companions to bringing her back in a modern series to giving her a spin-off, and it all happened because of this episode. Like I said, it's such a small and yet huge episode. Small in the fact that it's not a two-parter, it's not a finale, it's not a big crazy one. And the plot itself is not bad, but relatively simple, all things considered. But because you've got confrontations with the principal, because you've got the Sarah Jane and K9 stuff, and the dynamic between Rose and all that stuff, it's such a really good episode. The only thing I find odd, and this isn't so much criticism of any particular episode, is this episode makes a big deal about how Sarah Jane's been feeling now that the Doctor's gone, or he's got other companions, and so on. I do find it odd that, she leaves in with the 4th Doctor, and there's a whole bit about how she has to leave. But then, obviously, you've got the 5 Doctors where she comes back, and she doesn't really get a chance to really focus on the feelings that she's having in this episode. It's a bit of an odd point. Now, obviously, hey, it's different writers at a different time, but, Sarah Jane seems perfectly okay with the fact that her life has moved on with without the Doctor in the 5 Doctors, but here she makes a big fuss about how she misses him. I don't know if it's a bit of an inconsistency, but it's an interesting thing I've thought about. But I'm not going to let that take away from some of the amazing scenes with the Doctor and the Principal, or Sarah Jane, or all this stuff. It's such a small, underrated episode that really made me fall in love with the show, and makes the show just feel much bigger, because a lot of the time, whether it's Modern Who or Classic Who, once you move on from a companion or a Doctor, or anything for that matter, you kind of just forget the past, move on. And I like this, the whole theme of this episode is you can't always just forget the past and move on, because that's kind of the Doctor's approach, and it's kind of the show's approach, but it's bring back Sarah Jane, it's like, well, no, you can't forget the past and move on. And I like the idea that it's almost kind of referencing the show. So there you have it, my top 10 ranking for Series 2. Probably a much more odd list than a lot of other people say, but I'm not sure what people feel about Series 2, to be honest. I know my feelings about some of the later seasons might match up, but I'll be really interested to see what people think about Series 2, because it's a very mixed season, all things considered, and I think it's one that people overlook in comparison to Series 1, or definitely Series 3 and 4. So, yeah, Series 2 is such a mixed, self-contained season that, it kind of wraps up the end of an era in some ways, and has a lot of good small stories. But anyway, I will eventually do a ranking for Series 3 and all the other seasons of Doctor Who, so see you next time, guys.